cold seeped through the silk of her wedding gown, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air in the great hall, and everything to do with the man whose fingers were digging into the flesh of her arm. Elleraine Winthor kept her eyes fixed on the elder standing before the altar stone, his face a grim mask of tradition. To look anywhere else was to see the hundreds of averted gazes, the pitying glances, and the cold, hard stares of a pack that had already cast her out. The scent of cloying white lilies and ritual smoke filled her lungs, thick and funereal. This was not a marriage, it was a sentencing. Valerius, her mate-to-be, leaned close, his breath a sour wave of triumph against her ear. "Smile, little Omega," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "Today you become mine, and tonight I will teach you the price of defiance." A tremor worked its way up her spine. The bruises hidden beneath her long sleeves throbbed in time with her frantic heartbeat. A painful map of his courtship. He was the son of their pack's alpha, a cruel and entitled man whose wolf was as vicious as his fists. And she, a wolfless omega, marked by a cruel fate, was his prize. A way to solidify his power, to own something utterly broken. The elder began the rite of union, his voice droning through the oppressive silence. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her life. She felt the weight of every eye in the hall, could almost hear their thoughts. Unworthy, disgraced, lucky to be taken at all. They didn't see the woman. They saw the stain on their pack's honor. A shifter who could not shift. A mate who could not produce heirs. An empty vessel. Valerius's grip tightened, dragging her forward the final step. "Your vow, Elleraine." She opened her mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. The words of submission, of binding herself to this monster for eternity, caught in her throat like shards of glass. Her gaze flickered to his father, Alpha Marcus, whose stony expression offered no reprieve. This was his will. The pack's will. Her suffering was a small, necessary sacrifice for their stability. She began, her voice barely a whisper. The hall held its breath, waiting. This was the moment, the final surrender. It was then that the world exploded. The great oak doors at the back of the hall didn't open. They detonated. Splinters of ancient wood flew through the air as the thick iron hinges tore from the stone frame. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled pack. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the hall, smelling of pine, winter storms, and something ancient and predatory. It extinguished half the ceremonial candles, plunging the room into flickering shadows, and sending the lily petals scattering across the floor like pale ghosts. Every warrior, every elder, every wolf in the room was on their feet, growling, their postures shifting from ceremonial reverence to primal alert. Alpha Marcus roared, "Who dares?" Silence was his only answer, but it was a silence heavier and more terrifying than any shout. Into the shattered doorway stepped a figure who seemed to suck all the light and warmth from the room. He was a giant of a man, cloaked in dark furs that did little to hide the sheer breadth of his shoulders. The whispers started instantly, hushed and terrified, spreading through the crowd like a contagion. The king. Kaelstrom Ardenvale. The name itself was a curse, a legend spoken to frighten pups. The alpha of alphas. The king of the northern wastes. A man said to have a heart of ice and a wolf made of shadows and rage. He was a myth, a nightmare. And he was here. His presence was an overwhelming force. He moved with a liquid grace that defied his size, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone flags. His face was all harsh angles and brutal beauty, framed by black hair that fell past his shoulders. A jagged scar sliced down from his left temple, crossing his eye and ending at the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent, merciless snarl. But it was his eyes that held the hall captive. They weren't just the gold of a shifter. They were molten, burning with an inner fire that promised annihilation. He ignored the snarling warriors who parted before him as if cleaved by an invisible blade. He ignored Alpha Marcus, whose own formidable presence seemed to shrink and wither. The king's gaze swept the room once, a predatory assessment before it landed on her, on Elleraine, and in that instant, the world stopped turning. That burning gaze pinned her, stripped away the wedding dress, the pack, the hall, until there was nothing but her and the storm in his eyes. A strange, forgotten instinct deep in her soul, a thing she thought long dead, stirred to life. A faint primal thrumming began in her blood. A terrifying hum of recognition. Valerius, blinded by arrogance, seemed immune to the fear gripping everyone else. He shoved her behind him, stepping forward to meet the king. "You trespass on my lands, King Kalstrom. On my wedding day. You have no authority here." The king didn't even spare him a glance. His focus remained entirely on Elleraine, a look of such focused intensity it felt like a physical touch. He took another step, and another, his approach as inexorable as a glacier. "I am taking what is mine," the king's voice rumbled, not loud but carrying a weight that vibrated in the very stones of the hall. It was the sound of mountains grinding together, of thunder in a deep canyon. Valerius laughed, a short, ugly bark. "She is my mate. The bond is being sealed as we speak. You will leave, or my pack will—" He never finished the threat. Kalstrom crossed the remaining distance in a blur of motion. One massive hand shot out, not striking Valerius, but seizing the front of his ceremonial tunic and lifting him effortlessly off the ground. Valerius choked, his feet dangling uselessly. The king's molten eyes finally bored into him, and the last of Valerius's bravado evaporated, replaced by raw animal terror. Kalstrom leaned in, his voice dropping to a lethal growl that only those nearest could hear. "You would claim a queen? You, who are less than the dirt beneath her feet? You will never touch her again." With a flick of his wrist, he threw Valerius aside. He didn't fly across the room. He crumpled, landing in a heap at his father's feet, gasping for air. Then, the king turned back to Elleraine. He stood before her, a titan wreathed in shadow and fury. The scent of him was intoxicating, pine needles, cold stone, and the clean, sharp smell of a blizzard. It was wild and untamed, and it called to a part of her she didn't know existed. He reached for her and she flinched, expecting a blow, a rough grip like the one she was so used to. But his touch was nothing like that. His fingers, calloused and hard, brushed against her cheek with a shocking gentleness. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his gaze searching her face, cataloging the fear in her eyes, the faint bruise already forming on her cheek from Valerius's temper that morning. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest, a promise of retribution. He tore his eyes from hers and swept his gaze over the silent, watching pack. His voice rose, rolling through the hall like thunder, an edict that would never be questioned. "She's mine, and I'm not asking." Chaos erupted. Valerius, recovering his breath, screamed in a fit of pure, impotent rage. His wolf surfaced, a guttural roar of challenge that was answered by the snarls of his loyalists. Alpha Marcus finally found his voice, bellowing for his warriors to attack, but the king was already moving. Before anyone could take a step, he scooped Elleraine into his arms. She gave a small cry of shock. He held her against his chest as if she weighed nothing more than a child. Her face pressed against the cool leather of his tunic. The solid, steady beat of his heart was a drum against her ear, a rhythm of absolute power. He turned and strode back toward the shattered doorway, not rushing, but moving with the unstoppable certainty of a force of nature. The pack warriors hesitated, their instincts warring with their alpha's command. To attack the king was suicide, and their wolves knew it. They growled and postured, but they did not advance. As he carried her over the threshold, out of the suffocating hall and into the biting cold of the night, Elleraine twisted her head to look at him. For the first time, she saw him not as a terrifying legend or a violent savior, but as a man. The moonlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair and traced the harsh line of the scar across his face. His expression was grim, his jaw set, but in the depths of his burning eyes, she saw something beyond rage, beyond possession. It was a flicker of ancient pain, of a profound and terrible loneliness that mirrored her own. A single, silent tear escaped her and traced a cold path down her cheek. She didn't know if she had been rescued or merely stolen by a more powerful captor. His arms were a cage, yet for the first time in years, she could breathe. The sharp, clean air of the forest filled her lungs, and with it, the terrifying, undeniable scent of her destiny. The world was a blur of black and silver. Trees streaked past like ink strokes on a moonlit canvas, their branches reaching for her like skeletal fingers. The wind was a physical thing, a solid wall of cold that tore at her hair and bit at the exposed skin of her neck and arms. Elleraine buried her face deeper into the hard warmth of the king's chest, her thin silk dress offering no protection. He moved with an impossible, ground-eating speed, not running, but striding with a preternatural power that devoured the forest path. There was no sound of pursuit, no howls from her former pack. It was as if he had stepped out of their world and into his own, taking her with him. Her mind, still reeling, tried to catch up. One moment she was standing at an altar, seconds from being shackled to a monster for life. The next, she was in the arms of a myth, being carried into a wilderness she did not know. The shock was a merciful numbness, a blanket over the terror that threatened to consume her. Kalestrom, the Alpha King, a name used to end arguments, to scare unruly pups into submission. Behave, or the Shadow King will come for you. He wasn't supposed to be real, and yet, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear was the most real thing she had ever felt. His body was a furnace against the night's chill. Through the leather of his tunic, she could feel the coiled strength of his muscles, the sheer density of him. He held her securely, one arm banded around her back, the other under her knees, but his grip was not bruising like Valerius's had been. It was firm, absolute, the hold of a man accustomed to taking and holding whatever he wanted. The thought sent a fresh spike of fear through her. What did he want with her? An Omega who couldn't shift, couldn't bear children, couldn't even speak for herself most days. A broken thing. Perhaps he had just wanted to display his power, to humiliate a lesser alpha on a whim. She was just a pawn, a trophy to be discarded when he grew bored. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. After what felt like an eternity, his pace slowed. The dense, wild forest began to thin, opening into a hidden vale nestled between towering granite cliffs. Moonlight spilled into the clearing, illuminating a scene of disciplined order. A handful of warriors stood sentinel at the edges of the clearing, their forms half hidden in the long shadows of the pines. They were huge, even larger than the biggest fighters in her pack, and clad in the same dark furs and worn leather as their king. They were silent, their stillness that of predators at rest, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dark. A single, smokeless, fire burned in the center of the camp, its low flames casting a warm, flickering light on their grim faces. As Kalestrom entered the clearing, they did not speak, but merely dipped their heads in a gesture of profound respect. He finally stopped beside the fire and with a slow, deliberate movement, set her on her feet. Her legs, numb from the journey, trembled and threatened to buckle. She instinctively reached out, her hands landing on his forearms to steady herself. The contact was like touching solid rock, warm from his exertion. She snatched her hands back as if burned, wrapping her arms around her own waist. Now, standing before him, the sheer scale of him was even more apparent. He towered over her, a mountain of a man wreathed in shadow and moonlight. The firelight played across the harsh planes of his face, deepening the shadows in the hollows of his cheeks, and making the scar that cut across his eye seem like a fresh wound. His molten gold eyes watched her, unblinking, their intensity a physical pressure. He was assessing her, and she felt as transparent as glass, every fear, every flaw, laid bare for his inspection. A woman detached herself from the shadows. She was tall and lean, with a braid of silver blonde hair that fell to her waist, and eyes the color of a winter sky. A long, curved blade was strapped to her back, and her face was a mask of fierce, unwavering loyalty. She approached the king, her gaze flicking to Elleraine with open suspicion, before settling on him. "My king," she said, her voice low and crisp. "No pursuit. The Stonemaw pack is in chaos, but they are not foolish enough to follow." "They know their place, Brynja," Kalestrom rumbled, his voice a low vibration in the quiet clearing. He never took his eyes off Elleraine. "They know what happens when a cur bites the hand of a king." The woman, Brynja, gave a curt nod. Her gaze lingered on Elleraine's torn and dirt-stained wedding dress. "And the girl?" "She is cold," was all he said. Before Elleraine could process the words, he was shrugging out of his heavy cloak. It was immense, fashioned from the pelt of some great black beast, thick and lined with softer fur. He draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was staggering. It enveloped her completely, falling almost to her ankles. But it was the warmth that shocked her, a deep radiating heat that held the scent of him, pine, storm, and a clean masculine scent that was uniquely his. It was overwhelming, a possessive brand that settled over her and chased away the invasive chill. She clutched the edges of the cloak, her knuckles white, breathing in the scent that somehow felt like safety and danger all at once. "Water," he commanded. And a moment later, a wooden cup was pressed into her hands. Her fingers were trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She looked up at him, questioning. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. She took a hesitant sip. The water was cold and clean, and she realized how parched her throat was. She drank it all, the simple act grounding her in the surreal moment. He watched her, his head tilted slightly. "Valerius marked you," he stated. It wasn't a question. His gaze was fixed on her arm, where the silk of her sleeve had torn, revealing the faint ugly purple of a fingerprint bruise. Elleraine flinched, instinctively pulling the heavy cloak tighter to hide the evidence of her shame. The pack had seen her bruises for months and said nothing. It was her due, the price of being mated to a strong alpha. To have this man, this terrifying king, notice it so plainly made her feel raw and exposed. A low growl started deep in Karlstrom's chest, a sound so menacing that the very air seemed to crackle with pressure. The fire flared as if in response. Brynja and the other warriors subtly shifted their weight, their hands moving closer to the hilts of their weapons, their posture reflecting the sudden, violent turn in their alpha's mood. "He will not touch you again," Karlstrom vowed, his voice a blade of ice. "I will burn his pack to the ground and salt the earth where his hall stood before he lays a hand on you." The ferocity of his promise stole her breath. No one had ever spoken for her, ever defended her. To be protected was a foreign concept, and coming from him, it was terrifying. Protection from a man like this came at a price, and she was afraid she didn't have anything left to pay with. He seemed to sense her fear. The tension in his shoulders eased fractionally, the growl subsiding. He took a half-step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to scramble backward. The air around him was thick with power, a tangible aura that demanded submission. "Elleraine," he said, "her name." He spoke her name, and it was not the dismissive slur Valerius had made it, nor the pitying whisper of the other Omegas. He said it as if it were a word of power, a key. The sound of it on his tongue sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. It resonated deep in her bones, in that dormant part of her soul that had stirred in the hall. She looked up, meeting his gaze fully for the first time without the shield of shock. She saw the rage there, yes, but beneath it, she saw that same flicker from before, that profound, aching loneliness. A king in a world of his own making, surrounded by warriors, but utterly alone. It was a mirror to her own existence, an outcast in a world that should have been her home. He leaned down, not in a threatening way, but to bring his face level with hers. The proximity was dizzying. She could see the intricate lines around his eyes, the way the firelight caught the silver streaks at his temples. He wasn't looking at her lips or her body. His gaze was on her neck, just below her ear. He inhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. His eyes closed for a single, long moment. The harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, his expression shifting from one of grim command to something far more complex. Reverence, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible certainty. When he opened his eyes again, the fire in them burned brighter, hotter. The ambient sounds of the forest, the crickets, the rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire, all seemed to fade into nothingness. There was only the charged space between them. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, sending a jolt through her entire system. "The scent of the winter moon," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't a myth. The words hung in the space between them, more substantial than the smoke coiling from the fire. The scent of the winter moon. It wasn't a myth. Elleraine stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. For her entire life, her scent had been a source of shame. While other shifters carried the rich, earthy aromas of their wolves, musk and pine, soil and river water, hers was faint, ethereal, and deemed incomplete. The elders had called it the scent of a barren winter, a sign of her wolfless curse. It was the reason she was considered defective, unworthy. Yet this king, this terrifying force of nature, spoke of it as if it were a lost treasure. He finally straightened, breaking the intense proximity, and the air rushed back into Elleraine's lungs. He turned his head slightly, a silent command to the silver-haired warrior, Brynja. She will eat. Brynja's expression was a carefully crafted mask of neutrality, but her pale eyes held a flicker of something sharp and questioning as she looked at Elleraine. She looked at her not as a person, but as a complication, a disruption to the harsh, disciplined order of their lives. Without a word, she moved to the fire, ladling a thick, savory-smelling stew from an iron pot into a wooden bowl. She handed it to Elleraine, her movements efficient and devoid of warmth. The bowl was hot against Elleraine's cold hands. The steam carried the scent of roasted meat, wild herbs, and root vegetables. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She hadn't been allowed to eat that day. Valerius had said a bride should be pure and empty. She sat on a log near the fire, Karlstrom's heavy cloak a comforting weight around her, and lifted the spoon with a trembling hand. The camp was unnervingly silent. The handful of other warriors remained at their posts, their gazes constantly scanning the dark perimeter of the forest. They were a pack, but not like hers had been. There was no boisterous shouting, no petty squabbles for dominance. There was only a quiet, lethal purpose that bound them together, a purpose that revolved entirely around the man who now stood staring into the flames as if searching for answers in their dance. Elleraine ate, each spoonful a small act of rebellion against the life she had just escaped. The stew was rich and nourishing, warming her from the inside out. With every bite, a fraction of her strength returned. She watched the king from beneath her lashes. He was a study in contained violence. Every line of his body, from his broad shoulders to his powerful stance, spoke of a capacity for brutal action, yet he held it in check with an iron will. He was a storm held in abeyance. Why had he come for her? His words about her scent offered a clue, but it was one that made no sense. When she finished, she placed the empty bowl beside her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. It was Karlstrom who finally broke it. His voice a low rumble that cut through the night. "In my line," he began, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "The stories of the first kings are not myths. They are history. They tell of a time when our wolves were not just beasts of flesh and blood, but spirits of the wild itself, bound to the seasons." He turned his head, and his molten gaze found hers across the flames. The Ardenvale line began with a king whose wolf was the embodiment of winter, a creature of shadow, ice, and relentless strength. But his power was untamed, a blizzard without end. It was said that only one soul could temper his storm, the Winter Queen, a mate born under a silent moon, carrying the scent of the first frost on a sleeping world. A woman whose spirit was not in a wolf that walked the earth, but in the quiet, unshakable heart of winter itself. Elleraine's breath hitched, the scent of a barren winter, the Elder's curse, Karlstrom's prophecy. They were two sides of the same coin. She was a legend, he continued, his voice laced with a strange dark current of emotion, a promise. For generations my ancestors have grown weaker. The fire in our blood cools. Our wolves are strong, but they are shadows of what they once were. A curse laid upon our line, they say, one that can only be broken by the return of the queen. He took a step toward her, moving around the fire until he stood before her. They hunted for her, generation after generation. They searched for a woman with no wolf, whose scent was of cold air and sleeping earth. They found nothing. The story became a children's tale. A myth. He knelt before her. The motion was so shocking, so utterly contrary to the absolute authority he projected, that Elleraine physically recoiled. A king did not kneel, especially not to a disgraced Omega. His warriors stiffened at the edges of the camp, their hands tightening on their weapons, but a subtle gesture from him froze them in place. He was now at her level, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his scarred face. His eyes, burning with an intensity that seemed to scorch her very soul, held hers. "I was not searching," he confessed, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate whisper that was for her alone. "I had given up hope. I came to the Stonewall lands to deliver an ultimatum over a border dispute, and then I scented it on the wind. Faint, almost lost, the scent of the winter moon." He reached out, his hand moving with unnerving slowness. She flinched, but he didn't touch her face. Instead, his gaze dropped to her bare feet, which were scratched and bruised from the moment he had set her down. A thin, angry red line ran across the top of her left foot, beaded with a few drops of blood where she'd scraped it on a rock. Before she could react, he gently took her foot in his massive hand. His touch was firm, yet incredibly careful. Her entire body went rigid with shock. No one had touched her with such care, ever. Valerius's touch was for punishment and possession. The Pax was for pity or dismissal. This was something else entirely. It was reverence. He produced a small flask of water and a clean strip of linen from a pouch at his belt. With painstaking gentleness, he cleaned the cut. The simple, practical act was so profound, so deeply intimate, that it shattered the last of her numb composure. A single hot tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto his hand. He paused, his thumb brushing away the moisture from his skin, but he did not look up. He simply continued his task, wrapping the linen around her foot with a practiced efficiency that spoke of a life spent in the wild. The dormant thing inside her, the part of her soul she had thought dead, was now wide awake. It was a low, humming vibration in her chest, a warmth spreading through her veins that originated from the point where his hand held her foot. It was a feeling of rightness, a terrifying magnetic pull toward this man, this king of shadows and storms. Her spirit, her broken and wolfless self, was answering a call she had never known she was meant to hear. He finished wrapping the bandage and was slow to release her. His thumb stroked the arch of her foot once, a possessive, grounding touch. He finally lifted his head, his golden eyes locking with hers. The firelight reflected in their depths, making them look like twin gates to a furnace. The rage was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous: certainty. "You are no Omega, Elleraine," he said, his voice a gravelly declaration that resonated deep within her. "You are the other half of a soul that has been bleeding for 1,000 years. You are the stillness to my storm. You are the heart of my winter." He released her foot and rose to his full, intimidating height. He stood over her, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. The air crackled, the space between them charged with the weight of his revelation. She was not broken. She was a key, a prophecy, a queen. It was too much to comprehend, a truth so vast it threatened to tear her apart. Her past and this impossible present were at war within her. He must have seen the conflict in her eyes, the terror warring with a dawning, fragile hope. He reached out again, but this time his target was not a wound. His fingers, calloused from sword and strife, came to rest with impossible softness on the side of her neck, right over the frantic pulse that beat there. His thumb rested in the hollow of her throat. It was not a violent gesture, but it was an act of ultimate possession, a prelude to a claim. The moment his skin touched hers, a shockwave of energy, cold and silver like moonlight on ice, arced between them. A faint ethereal light pulsed from the point of contact, a soft silver glow that illuminated the stunned look on her face and the fierce, triumphant fire in his eyes. It wasn't a mark, it wasn't a bite. It was an awakening. The silver light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving phantom trails against Elleraine's vision. But the feeling remained, a resonant hum beneath her skin, a current of energy that connected her to the king. His hand was still on her neck, his thumb a point of searing heat at the base of her throat. Her heart hammered against it, a frantic bird beating against the bars of a cage. The world had narrowed to this single point of contact, to the molten gold of his eyes, and the raw, possessive power pouring from him in waves. He saw the terror in her eyes, the sheer, overwhelming shock, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than command crossed his face. It was a hint of uncertainty, the briefest hesitation of a man who had not known hesitation in a century. He had stated a fact of the universe, "You are mine," but he was now faced with the terrified woman who had to live with that truth. His thumb stroked her skin once, a slow, deliberate motion that was meant to soothe but sent a fresh cascade of shivers through her. He withdrew his hand, and the loss of contact was a physical wrench, leaving her skin feeling cold and strangely empty. "Brynja," he said, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. "Prepare a tent for her. Use my furs." The silver-haired warrior, who had been watching the entire exchange with a stony, inscrutable expression, simply nodded. She moved with her usual efficiency, disappearing into the shadows and reappearing moments later with a tightly bound roll of canvas and a thick stack of furs. In the practiced silence of the camp, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of canvas as Brynja and another warrior erected a small, sturdy tent, a short distance from the flames, in the protective lee of a large granite boulder. Elleraine watched them, her mind struggling to process the shift. A tent, furs. These were gestures of care, of provision. They were utterly alien to her. In her pack, her needs had always been an afterthought, her comfort a currency she did not possess. To be treated as something precious was disorienting. She clutched the heavy cloak, his cloak, tighter around her shoulders, the unfamiliar scent of pine and winter, a confusing anchor in a sea of change. Kylstrom did not speak to her again immediately. He moved to the edge of the clearing, a dark, brooding silhouette against the moonlit forest, conversing in low, guttural tones with his warriors. They were planning, assessing. She was the unexpected element, the unforeseen prize that had altered the course of their mission. She could feel Brynja's gaze on her, sharp and analytical. It was not the contemptuous pity of her old pack, but something colder. Brynja was gauging her, weighing her. She was the king's second, and Elleraine was a threat to the stability of their world, a prophecy that could be a blessing or a curse. When the tent was ready, Brynja approached. "It is prepared," she said, her voice flat. She held out a hand, not to help, but to gesture. Elleraine rose, her legs still unsteady, and followed the warrior. The inside of the tent was small, but it was a haven from the biting wind. The ground was covered with a thick, waterproof oilcloth, and on top of that, a mountain of furs was piled. Black wolf pelts, deep brown bear hides, and the impossibly soft, pale fur of some snow creature she didn't recognize. The scent of Kylstrom was even stronger in here, embedded deep in the fibers of the furs. It was an intimate, possessive claiming of the space, and now, of her. Brynja lingered at the tent flap for a moment. "The king has many enemies," she said abruptly, her winter sky eyes pinning Elleraine. "More than any wolf has a right to. He did not need a weakness." The implication was clear. Elleraine was that weakness, a fragile, wolfless stray he had dragged into their dangerous world. The words were a slap, a cold dose of reality that cut through the haze of myth and prophecy. She was not a queen. She was a liability. Elleraine met her gaze, lifting her chin slightly. She had no voice to argue, no words to defend herself, but she would not cower, not anymore. She had spent a lifetime cowering, and it had earned her nothing but bruises and contempt. For a long moment, the two women stared at each other, one a hardened warrior, the other a silent unknown. Brynja's expression didn't soften, but a flicker of something, perhaps grudging respect for her defiance, passed through her eyes. She gave a curt nod and was gone, leaving Elleraine alone in the borrowed warmth. She sank into the furs, the sheer luxury of their softness a shock to her senses. Exhaustion, deep and bone-weary, finally washed over her. The adrenaline of the past few hours faded, leaving behind a profound ache. It wasn't just physical, it was the ache of a soul that had been stretched to its breaking point. She curled into a tight ball, her dirt-stained wedding dress a ridiculous, ghostly shroud in the darkness. She should be terrified. She was terrified. But beneath the fear was a strange, unfamiliar calm. Valerius could not touch her here. Her pack could not scorn her here. In this tent, surrounded by the scent of a storm, she was, for the first time in years, safe. She fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. She awoke to a hand on her shoulder. Her eyes flew open, a scream catching in her throat as her instinct screamed Valerius. But the hand was too large, the grip too steady, the scent all wrong. It was Kälstrom. He was kneeling beside her pallet of furs, the pale pre-dawn light filtering through the canvas, casting his face in shades of gray. He must have entered the tent as silently as a shadow. "Easy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "You are safe." She pushed herself up, her heart still pounding. He was holding out a water skin and a piece of dried, salted meat. The offering was simple, practical. It was the food of a warrior on the move, not a king in his court. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his. The brief contact was a spark of static electricity in the cold air. She drank and ate in silence, acutely aware of his presence. He wasn't watching her with the predatory intensity of the night before. His gaze was softer, more contemplative, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. He was close enough now that she could see the finer details of the scar that marred his face. It was an old wound, silvered with age, a brutal white line against his weathered skin. It didn't make him look ugly, it made him look real, a man who had fought and bled and survived. It was a mark of his history, just as the hidden bruises on her ribs were a mark of hers. Impulsively, driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she reached out. Her fingers, small and pale against his rugged skin, traced the path of the scar from his temple down his cheek. He went utterly still, his breath catching. His skin was rough beneath her fingertips, the scar tissue a smooth, cool ridge. She was touching his history, his pain. It was a shockingly intimate act. His eyes closed, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. When he opened them again, the molten gold was turbulent. A storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. Rage, pain, and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. He caught her hand, his fingers engulfing hers, and brought it to his lips. He didn't kiss her palm or her knuckles. He turned her hand over and pressed his lips to the delicate skin of her wrist, directly over her pulse point. It was not a kiss of passion, but of fealty. An ancient, solemn gesture of a knight to his queen. The touch of his lips, slightly chapped from the wind, was a brand against her skin. He released her hand slowly. "That scar," he said, his voice thick, "was a gift from my uncle, the day he tried to steal my throne and murdered my father. I was 15. The stark confession hung in the air. He was sharing his wound, reciprocating her silent touch. He was showing her the place where he was broken. And in that shared moment of vulnerability, something profound shifted. The chasm between the mighty king and the broken Omega began to close. She looked at the violence etched on his face, and he looked at the fear etched in her soul, and they saw a reflection of their own loneliness. He was not just a myth, and she was not just a prophecy. They were two scarred people, brought together by a destiny that was only just beginning to unfold. He rose to his feet, the intimacy of the moment broken. "We ride at sunrise," he said, his voice once again that of a commander. "The journey to Ardenvale is long and perilous. We are not safe until we are behind its walls." He turned to leave, but paused at the tent flap. He looked back at her, curled in his furs, her eyes wide in the gloom. "I know you are afraid, Elleraine," he said, his voice softening once more. "But you are no longer a captive. Whatever comes next, you will face it as a queen, not a victim. I swear it." With that vow, he was gone, leaving her alone with the echo of his words, the ghost of his touch on her wrist, and the terrifying, exhilarating certainty that her life had been irrevocably fractured, only to be forged into something new in the heart of a king's fire. The journey north was a brutal education. They moved with relentless, punishing speed, forgoing established paths for the wild, untamed heart of the forest. Kälstrom set a pace that would have crippled any normal pack, but his warriors were wolves of a different breed. They were tireless, their senses honed to a razor's edge, their movements economical and silent. They were the king's shadow, and Elleraine was the precious, fragile thing they now guarded. Kälstrom had procured a horse for her, a sturdy black mountain Garin with a calm temperament. He himself walked, leading the horse by its reins, his long strides easily keeping pace. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, solid wall between her and the dangers of the wilderness. When a ravine was too steep to ride, he lifted her from the saddle without a word and carried her across, his arms an unyielding cradle. When the nights grew so cold that her teeth chattered uncontrollably, he would sit with his back to hers before the fire, a silent, living furnace sharing his warmth until she could sleep. These were not acts of romance. They were practical, necessary gestures. Yet each one was a thread, weaving a silent bond between them. Elleraine found herself watching him, studying the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the subtle tensing of his jaw, when the wind carried a strange scent, the effortless authority with which he commanded his warriors through a series of hand signals. He was a creature of this wild, unforgiving land, and she was beginning to understand that his harsh exterior was a reflection of the world he ruled. Her fear of him was slowly being replaced by something far more complex. It was a deep, instinctual trust, the kind a lost animal has for the predator that inexplicably offers it shelter instead of death. The thrumming in her blood, the call of her spirit to his, was a constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. It was strongest when he was near, a magnetic pull that made the space between them feel charged and alive. On the third night, they made camp in the ruins of an ancient watchtower, its crumbling stone walls offering some protection from a biting wind that carried the first hint of snow. The mood in the camp was tense. Brynja and another scout, a grim-faced man named Jorund, had returned from a patrol with grim news. "They are following," Jorund reported to the king, his voice a low growl. "Not Stonemaw dogs. These are trackers. Hired claws. Southern." Kaelstrom's eyes narrowed, the firelight glinting in their golden depths. "How many?" "A dozen. Fast. They know the old paths. They'll be on us by morning." A cold knot of dread formed in Elleraine's stomach. Valerius, his father, Alpha Marcus. They hadn't accepted her loss. They had sent hunters. Not to reclaim her, she knew, to reclaim their honor, which meant killing her and the king who had shamed them. Kaelstrom's gaze flickered to her, and he saw the fear on her face. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He turned back to his warriors. "We don't run from jackals. We break their teeth. We make an example of them, so no other southerner dares to cross my border again. We set the trap at the Blackwater Gorge." The warriors nodded, their faces grim but resolute. There was no fear in them, only the cold, hard certainty of impending battle. They began their preparations, checking the edges of their blades, waxing their bowstrings, their movements imbued with a deadly purpose. Elleraine felt useless, a burden. She was the cause of this, the bait in a trap she couldn't help set. The familiar shame washed over her, the feeling of being a weakness, just as Brynja had said. She retreated to the edge of the firelight, wrapping her arms around her knees, making herself small. A shadow fell over her. It was Kaelstrom. He sat beside her on the cold stone, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The heat rolling off him was a comfort in the encroaching darkness. "This is not your fault, Elleraine," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at her, but stared into the fire, his profile harsh and regal against the flames. She flinched at the sound of her own name. No one had ever defended her from blame, least of all herself. "They hunt me, not you," he continued. "They have for years. You are merely the excuse they have been waiting for, an insult to their fragile pride that they believe gives them the right to challenge a king." He finally turned his head, his gaze pinning her. "But they have made a fatal miscalculation. They think they are hunting a man. They do not understand that by taking you, they have woken something far older." His words sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She saw it then, in the depths of his eyes, the shadow of his wolf. It was not the simple beast that lived within other shifters. It was something vast, ancient, and terrifying. The spirit of winter he had spoken of. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, intricately carved object. It was a wolf, fashioned from what looked like bone or ivory, yellowed with age. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every line of its snarling muzzle, every tuft of fur, rendered with incredible detail. He pressed it into her hand. It was cool and smooth to the touch. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice softer now, laced with a pain that was centuries old. She was the last in our line to carry a hint of the old blood, but it was not strong enough. The curse took her. It takes all the women of my line, a wasting sickness of the spirit. Our blood is too strong, too wild. It burns them out from the inside. That is the true nature of the Ardenvale curse. Elleraine stared at him, horrified. A king who could not have a queen. A line that was destined to die out in fire and ice. The seers said only the Winter Queen could withstand the king's fire, he whispered, his gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. That her spirit of ice was the only thing that could temper the blizzard in our souls. I thought it was a fairy tale, told to a dying boy to give him hope. He looked down at her hand, closed around the small wolf totem. He gently unfolded her fingers and placed his much larger hand over hers, sandwiching the cool ivory between their palms. Until I found you, he finished, his voice raw. The warmth of his hand seeped into hers, into the very bone. The humming in her blood intensified, rising to a clear, resonant note. It was a song of recognition, of coming home, the two halves of a whole finally touching. In that moment, she understood. Her wolflessness wasn't a deficiency. Her scent wasn't a mark of barrenness. Her entire existence, her very nature, was the answer to his. She was the key forged for the lock of his cursed bloodline. The weight of that destiny was crushing, but for the first time, it felt right. The broken pieces of her life began to align, to form a picture she was only just beginning to see. Tomorrow, he said, his voice hardening again as he drew back into the commander. There will be a battle. You will stay here, in the tower. Brynja will remain with you. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think is happening, you will not leave these walls. Do you understand? She looked into his eyes, into the face of the man who had stolen her, saved her, and shown her a truth about herself she never could have imagined. She gave a single, firm nod. He held her gaze for a beat longer, a silent, unspoken promise passing between them. Then he rose and walked back to his warriors, the king once more, preparing for war. Elleraine clutched the ivory wolf. It was more than a gift. It was a piece of his history, of his pain, entrusted to her. It was an unspoken claim. He was not just fighting for a border or against an insult. He was fighting for their future. He was fighting for her. And as she sat in the ruins, with the wind howling like a hungry wolf outside, she knew with a terrifying and absolute certainty that her heart was no longer her own. It now beat in the chest of the Shadow King. The dawn broke gray and sullen, the sky the color of dirty steel. A heavy mist clung to the ground, muffling all sound and turning the forest into a labyrinth of ghostly shapes. It was a hunter's dawn, and Elleraine felt the tension in the air like a physical pressure. Karlstrom and his warriors had departed before the first light, melting into the mist-shrouded trees as silently as wraiths. They left her and Brynja in the cold, crumbling watchtower, the silence they left behind more deafening than any battle cry. Brynja was a study in lethal stillness. She stood at a high arrow slit in the tower wall, her gaze fixed on the narrow gorge below, her hand resting loosely on the hilt of the great sword strapped to her back. She had not spoken a word since the men had left, her focus absolute. Elleraine huddled in a corner, Karlstrom's cloak wrapped tightly around her. The ivory wolf clutched in her hand. The totem was a small, solid piece of reality in a world that had become a nightmare of suspense. Hours crawled by. The mist began to thin as the sun climbed, but it did not burn away completely, leaving the landscape veiled and uncertain. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind, sent a fresh jolt of fear through Elleraine. She strained her ears, listening for the sounds of battle, shouts, snarls, the clash of steel. But there was nothing, only the mournful cry of a raven and the sighing of the wind through the stones. "They will come from the south ridge," Brynja said suddenly, her voice startlingly loud in the silence. "Jorund will let them pass. The king will be waiting at the bottleneck by the falls." She spoke as if reciting a catechism, a litany of faith in her king's strategy. But Elleraine could see the corded muscles in her neck, the white-knuckled grip on her sword. Even the unflappable Brynja was on edge. As if summoned by her words, a new sound drifted up from the gorge. It was faint at first, the clink of metal on rock, a low guttural laugh. Ellerain's heart leaped into her throat. The hunters. They were here. Brynja didn't move, her posture unchanging, but Ellerain could feel the shift in her, the coiling of a predator about to strike. The sounds grew louder, voices rough and arrogant. "Think the big bad king is tremblin' in his furs?" one man sneered. "He'll tremble when my blade opens his throat," another answered. "Alpha Marcus pays well for a king's pelt, and even better for the little wolfless bitch he stole." The crude words were a physical blow. Ellerain flinched, shame and fury warring within her. She was the prize, the excuse for this bloodshed. Suddenly, a single piercing whistle cut through the air. It was the signal. The gorge erupted into a symphony of violence. The sounds were not those of a clean, honorable battle. They were wet, brutal, and horrifyingly swift. A choked scream, the sickening crunch of bone, the wet tearing of flesh. There was no prolonged clash of swords, only the terrifying thuds of bodies hitting the ground and the low, murderous snarls of wolves, who were killing with brutal efficiency. It was an ambush, a slaughter. Ellerain scrambled to a different arrow slit, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold stone and peered down. Through the swirling mist, she could see flashes of the fight. Karlstrom's warriors were not men anymore. They were blurs of dark fur and flashing claws, moving with a speed and ferocity that was inhuman. They were the shadows of the forest come to life, and the southern trackers were being ripped apart. And then she saw him. Karlstrom. He was not in wolf form. He stood in the center of the carnage, a great sword in his hands that seemed to flow like an extension of his own arms. He moved with a deadly, unhurried grace, a whirlwind of steel and death. He was not fighting with the frenzied rage of his men. He was executing. Every parry, every thrust, was precise and final. He was the calm, cold eye of the storm, and all around him was chaos and death. The fight was over in minutes. The last tracker went down with a gurgling cry, his lifeblood staining the damp earth. Silence descended once more, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the panting of Karlstrom's wolves as they shifted back into human form, their bodies slick with blood. A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over Ellerain. He was safe. They were all safe. But then, a movement on the ridge opposite the tower caught her eye. A figure stepped out from behind a copse of ancient twisted oaks. He was a large man, clad in the fine leathers of an alpha. And standing beside him, his face a mask of incandescent rage, was Valerius. "Coward!" Valerius screamed, his voice echoing in the gorge. "You hide behind ambushes and tricks. Face me, you northern mongrel. She is mine." Karlstrom slowly lifted his head. He wiped his blood-splattered sword on a fallen hunter's tunic and pointed the tip at Valerius. "You are not worthy to speak her name. I am her fated mate." The bond was seconds from being sealed, Valerius shrieked, his fury pushing him past the point of reason. "I challenge you for her, a trial of souls." A collective gasp went through Karlstrom's men. Brynja, beside Ellerain, swore under her breath. A sharp, vicious curse. A trial of souls was the oldest law, a sacred right that superseded any alphas or even a king's authority. A direct challenge for a mate, to be fought to the death. To refuse was to admit the mate bond was false, to forfeit the claim. Alpha Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression grim. He had not wanted this. He had wanted a quiet assassination, not a public binding challenge, but the words were spoken. The challenge was made. Karlstrom's face was unreadable, a mask carved from stone. He looked from Valerius, consumed by his petty rage, up to the tower, his gaze finding Ellerain's in the narrow slit. He was not looking for permission, but in his eyes, she saw the question. This was her battle, her freedom being fought for. This final, bloody chapter was for her. She met his gaze across the distance and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A slow, terrible smile touched Karlstrom's lips. It was not a smile of mirth, but of grim, final satisfaction. He turned back to Valerius. "I accept your challenge." Valerius roared in triumph and leaped down into the gorge, shifting in midair. He landed as a massive, tawny-furred wolf, all bristling muscle and snarling aggression. He was large for a pack wolf, powerful and dangerous. but he was nothing compared to what happened next. Kjellström did not shift in a frenzy of motion. He simply closed his eyes, and the power that rolled off him was a physical wave that flattened the grass and sent pebbles skittering across the ground. The air grew impossibly cold. The mist thickened, swirling around him, turning from gray to an ominous, shadowy black. A low groan, like the sound of a glacier cracking, echoed through the gorge. When he opened his eyes, they were no longer gold. They were the pure, terrifying white of a blizzard, devoid of pupil or iris. His skin seemed to pale, and the scar on his face glowed with a faint, frosty light. He did not grow fur. The shadows themselves seemed to coalesce around him, forming the shape of a wolf so vast it beggared belief. It was a creature of night and ice, its form flickering and indistinct at the edges, its paws leaving trails of frost on the ground. Its growl was not the sound of a living animal. It was the howl of a winter storm, the grinding of ancient ice. Valerius's wolf, which had seemed so formidable a moment before, faltered. It took a step back, a whine of pure, primal terror escaping its throat. Every instinct it possessed screamed at it to flee, to submit, to roll over and expose its belly to this God. But the man's pride was stronger than the wolf's instinct. With a final desperate roar, Valerius charged. The shadow wolf did not move. It simply watched the tawny wolf's approach with its blank white eyes. At the last possible second, as Valerius leaped for its throat, a single shadowy paw, larger than Valerius's entire head, swiped through the air. There was no sound of impact, only a faint sigh, like the wind. Valerius's body flew sideways, tumbling through the air like a broken doll, and crashed against the rock wall of the gorge with a sickening final crack. He did not move again. The shadow wolf stood over the broken body of its foe for a long moment. Then the shadows dissolved, the impossible cold receded, and Kjellström stood once more in his human form, his eyes returning to their normal molten gold. He had not a single scratch on him. High on the ridge, Alpha Marcus let out a cry of pure anguish and fell. To his knees, his pack was broken, his son was dead. His war was lost before it had even begun. Kjellström paid him no mind. He lifted his gaze back to the tower, back to Elleraine. He had not just won a fight. He had not just defended his claim. He had proven what he'd told her from the beginning. She was the heart of his winter, and without her, his storm was a thing of pure, untempered annihilation. He had just executed his rival, but the look in his eyes was one of profound, aching loneliness. He had unleashed the monster within him to save her, and now he was asking if she could still look at him without fear. And as she looked down at the king, standing alone amidst the carnage he had wrought for her, Elleraine knew the answer. Fear was the last thing she felt. All that was left was the overwhelming, undeniable certainty of the bond between them, a bond that had just been sealed in blood and shadow, witnessed by the old gods of the forest. Her trial was over. His was just beginning. 3 winters had passed, 3 seasons of snow blanketing the northern wastes, dusting the black stones of Ardenvale's fortress, and clinging to the needles of the ancient pines. Elleraine stood on a high balcony overlooking the valley, a heavy cloak of white fur, not his but her own, draped over her shoulders. The air was crisp and cold, so clean it stung her lungs, carrying the familiar scents of wood smoke, pine, and the ever-present hint of snow. It was a scent she no longer associated with barrenness, but with peace, with home. The fortress of Ardenvale was not a place of warmth and comfort in the southern sense. It was a testament to strength and endurance, its towers carved from the mountain itself, its halls vast and echoing, warmed by great roaring fires that never went out. It was a castle built for a winter king. In the beginning, its stark grandeur had intimidated her, its shadows seeming to hold the ghosts of 1,000 years of solitude, but now it was simply hers. Her touch was everywhere, in the soft furs draped over stone benches, in the hardy winter roses she had learned to cultivate in the protected courtyard, in the quiet alcove of the library where she'd painstakingly begun to piece together the fragmented lore of the Winter Queens. A small, strong hand slipped into hers. She looked down into a pair of serious, molten gold eyes. a perfect miniature of his father's. Her son, Torvin, was barely 2 years old, but he stood with a solid, grounded stance that was all Kjellström. He clutched a small, crudely carved wooden wolf in his other hand, a gift from Jorund. "Mama," he said, his voice a clear, piping sound in the quiet air. He pointed a chubby finger toward the training grounds below. "Papa." Elleraine smiled, a genuine, easy expression that had long ago replaced the haunted look she once wore. She followed her son's gaze. In the yard below, Kjellström was sparring with Brynja. He moved with the same lethal grace she remembered, but there was a subtle difference. The hard, lonely edges of him had softened. The ever-present storm in his soul was still there, but it was no longer a destructive blizzard threatening to break free. It was the controlled, awesome power of a winter that brings rest and renewal, not just death. Her arrival at Ardenvale had been a quiet affair. There was no grand ceremony. The king had simply brought her home, and his people, who had seen the bleakness in his eyes for a century, saw the change in him and understood. They had accepted her, not as a fragile Omega to be pitied, but as the missing piece of their king, the quiet center of his storm. Her wolflessness, her inability to speak, none of it mattered to them. They saw the way he looked at her, the way the very air in a room seemed to calm when she entered. They saw the truth of the old legends reborn. Her voice had returned slowly, hesitantly. It had started with a whispered word in the dead of night, his name, spoken against the scarred skin of his chest, as she woke from a nightmare of Valerius. Kjellström had gone utterly still, his arms tightening around her as if she were a ghost he was afraid would disappear. He had not pushed or prodded, but that single word had unlocked the cage fear had built around her throat. Now she spoke when she wished, her voice quiet but clear, a stark contrast to the booming authority of her king. As if sensing her gaze, Kjellström disarmed Brynja with a final fluid motion, clapping the warrior on the shoulder with a rare grin. He looked up at the balcony, and his eyes found hers. The raw, possessive fire was still there, but it was banked, tempered by a deep and abiding love that was as vast and wild as his northern kingdom. He lifted a hand in greeting, a gesture that was for her and Torvin alone. Torvin waved his wooden wolf enthusiastically. "Papa," he shouted again, his little voice filled with adoration. Kjellström's smile widened. It was a sight that still had the power to steal her breath. He was not a man made for smiling, and so when he did, it was like the sun breaking through a week of winter clouds, rare and breathtaking. Their son was the proof, the miracle that had silenced the last of the doubters. The Ardenvale curse, the wasting sickness that had claimed the lives of so many women, had found its end in her. Her spirit, the quiet, unshakable heart of winter, had not been burned away by his fire. It had met it, soothed it, and from their union, new life had sprung forth, strong and whole. Torvin had been born with his father's eyes, and a faint, sweet scent of the first snow, a perfect fusion of their souls. Later that evening, they sat before the great hearth in their private chambers. Torvin was asleep in his cradle, the ivory wolf totem Kjellström had given her tucked beside him. The firelight danced across her husband's face, tracing the familiar lines of his scar. He was cleaning a hunting knife, his large hands surprisingly deft. The silence between them was comfortable, woven from years of shared glances and unspoken understanding. "Jorund said he saw stonemaw markings on the southern border today," she said softly, breaking the quiet. Kjellström didn't look up from his work, but she saw his knuckles tighten slightly on the knife's hilt. "Scouts, nothing more. Marcus knows better than to challenge my lands again. He is a broken alpha, leading a broken pack." She knew he was right, but the name still sent a faint, ghostly chill through her. He sensed it immediately. He set the knife aside and reached for her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "He will never touch you again, Elleraine," he said, his voice a low, rumbling vow, the same one he had made on that first terrifying night. "No one will. This is your home. You are the queen of this land, and every wolf, every stone, and every pine tree in it knows your scent and calls you master." She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "I am not a master of anything, Kjellström. I am just home." He turned, his hand moving from hers to cup her jaw, tilting her face up to his. His molten eyes searched hers, filled with an emotion so fierce and profound it still humbled her. "You are the master of my soul," he whispered, his voice rough with sincerity. "You were from the moment I saw you standing in that hall, a winter lily in a field of thorns. You quieted a storm in me I thought would rage until I died." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that was not about passion, but about certainty. It was a kiss of promises kept, of a destiny fulfilled. It tasted of wood smoke, of winter, and of the unshakable love that had been forged in the crucible of violence and prophecy. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. She could feel the low thrum of his power, the steady beat of his heart, and the deep, resonant hum of her own spirit answering his. The two halves of a whole, forever intertwined. Outside, the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall, drifting down to blanket the kingdom in a fresh layer of white. It was a quiet, peaceful fall of snow, a promise of the long, restful winter ahead. The storm was calm, the king was home, and the Winter Queen, who had once been a broken, silent girl, was finally completely free.